Hi, welcome to the Prairie Oaks Bible Study. I'm glad you're joining me today. We're going to just jump right in. We're back in the book of Romans, and as I warned you, we're not doing justice to all the depth that is in this very dense meditative literature that is Paul's letter to the Romans. But we're going to try to do justice to a little bit of what is going on here in what is both controversial and a little bit complicated passage. Controversial not only in our day, but even in their day, this would have been controversial. So let's go through and make sure we do talk about the things that Paul's talking about here. Now, I want to preface it with what we looked at last time, 2 weeks ago, where Paul talks about that I'm not ashamed of the gospel of God, of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. And he says, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The just shall live by faith. And so he says this righteousness of God, the justice, the rightness of him, it's been revealed by faith. From faith in the past, faith today, we're there by faith. The just by faith shall live is another way of looking at that quote there. But he's going to turn it on its head here, because he's going to go from talking about the righteousness of God to the wrath of God. And he's using similar terminology that'll stand out to them as well as to us. So Paul says there's this righteousness, this is the good thing, but you need to also know about the wrath of God. And so verse 18 of Romans chapter 1, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness, in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lusts for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. This is the word of the Lord. And so he says the wrath of God has been revealed. God is angry about these things, and for good reason. That's what he's going to be unpacking here for us. It's revealed against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of humanity. God is righteous. God is godly. He does what is right. He does what is good. He does what is perfect. He does what is wise, and men are doing the direct opposite. And they're supposed to be his image bearers. He made them, not only just at the beginning, but he makes every single one of us handmade. We're told in the Psalms poetically. And not only that, we do a very poor job of imaging him in the world. We take what truth we have and we suppress it. We push it down. We suppress the truth with our unrighteousness. And unrighteousness can be both talking about injustice. We do injustice. We see it in the headlines all the time. Even the ones who are supposed to be workers of justice do injustice. But it's also just speaking of we do what is wrong. Instead of doing what is right, we do what is wrong. So we work against what is right and we do wrong. And how do they do that? Because what may be known of God is manifest. It's revealed in them. They have the eyes to see if they're willing to perceive what they see. God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, since the beginning, all of humanity has seen his invisibleness, his invisible things. Now, that's supposed to sound odd. This is one of those first of the difficult things that we've been looking at, maybe. How do we see what is invisible? Well, he says these things are clearly seen. And he gives two examples of those invisible things of God that are actually clearly seen in what we see in creation. And it's translated for us here, eternal power. But it's not the normal word for eternal, which kind of relates to time and age. But it refers to his alwaysness. And I thought that was really interesting. The God who is always. Kind of should remind you of Mount Sinai when God said, I am that I am. You tell them that I am sent you. And then Jesus borrowed that terminology because there is a way in which God is not only the beginning and the end, but he is beyond the beginning and the end because he is the one who invented time. And so he just always. And he is Godhead. Now, this is another word not used anywhere else in the New Testament. And I had someone ask the other day, what does Godhead even mean? And I kind of struggled with it for a while. And so then I looked in my dictionary and realized they're struggling with it too. But it's simply to say his godness. The things that make him God and no one else. Now, I think there's clues in this for us of who God is that makes him God. And one of those things is his righteousness, his rightness. But he's also his incorruptibility. Everything here is winding down. You know, the mountains are lasting forever, right? Well, they're eroding and, you know, they're changing. They're not unchangeable. But God is. That he is generous. Because if we're expected to be thankful, then he's doing something that we should be thanking him for. And so these are some of those invisible attributes that we see. That he exists, that he created, that he lives always. He is the God who is always, and that he's righteous. And God says that we are without excuse, all of humanity. That we dishonor God. We are without excuse because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. Didn't give thanks. And this is the point in which we probably ought to pause and say, they or I, do we always give God the glory he deserves? Credit where credit is due. Do we always give him thanks for all the things he does, but also just giving God thanks for who he is. Because what he does is an outflow of who he is. The things he gives us is because he is generous. He has more to give than we can receive because he is that much more than us. And so it's right here at the beginning, we realize this is not something that's a point your finger at others. This is something that's us. We're not always good at giving God credit and giving God thanks, but are a little too general about where the good things in life come from. And because we do that, we become futile in our thinking, in our foolish hearts, our imaginations. This is another couple unusual terms that Paul doesn't normally use, but they're darkened. They are corrupted by our unwillingness to give God credit and by our ingratitude. Pride does that to us, because that's really what it comes down to. Pride is the reason we don't give God credit for being God or give him thanks for what he does. And so in our internal dialogues, in our internal person, we turn towards what is foolish. What is just downright unreasonable is what it says there in verse 24. God gave them up to uncleanness. They professed to be wise. They became fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. We are the image bearers of God, and we instead made God into the image of things that are even below us, that are beneath us. Because we don't want a God that we owe gratitude to and who is over us. And so God says, all right, well, if you're going to be that foolish, you can be that foolish. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness and the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. So dishonoring him leads to us dishonoring ourselves. We dishonor the image of God in us by dishonoring the body that we indwell. And so we distorted God's image, making image of God to be less than who he is. Through our idolatry, we then begin to worship and serve lower things ourselves. There's the creator, he's the greater. We trade the truth for the lie. Do you see that? We suppress the truth, and then farther down, now we've exchanged the truth of God for the lie. Verse 25. Dishonoring our bodies among themselves, and we worship and serve creaturely things instead of the creator who actually made us and is sustaining us. And there's something to be said about ungratefulness, I think there's a lot of us that are like, well, that was really ungrateful of them. Well, this is maybe a little bit of coming back around, isn't it? Because we've been ungrateful for what God has given us. So let's continue the downward spiral. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. And again, he uses some unusual terminology here. But as they've darkened their thoughts, these now have darkened desires. Foolish, unreasonable desires. In dishonoring the body, now they dishonor their feelings, and they distort God's male and female image of God. That's how he made humanity, in male and female, and we distort that then through sexual misconduct. And I bring up again, these are not the normal words that Paul is using. He's actually referring to the physical natural order by which we're born. speaking of our sex at birth. And so this was controversial in their day as well as in our day. And God says, that's what is going on. They dishonored their thinking, and it became corrupted, and then in their desires, and even in their feelings. And that's where our feelings are a gift from God. They're warning lights. And we need to ask, why is that warning light on? Or they are feelings that are communicating to us good things sometimes. But they are, through our sin nature, they can also lead us astray. They can go off on the wrong things. I've got, and you probably have seen it before too, warning lights that won't work on my vehicle, and then there's warning lights that are on when there's nothing wrong. Don't know what to do with it. Can't be fixed. At least not from my end. And so he's telling us that they gave them up to vile passions. Their feelings have been distorted. As humanity rejects acknowledging that God exists and that God judges, God allows them to follow rejected thinking, rejected desires, and rejected feelings into obvious problems. And the obvious problems leads into a sin list. Paul makes lists of virtues. Paul makes lists of sins. This is one of his lists of sins. It's not because he's a killjoy. It's because he's the prophet who is warning people. But what is interesting about this list, before we dive into it, is that, well, oftentimes we as self-righteous people who want to pat ourselves on the back for how good we are, we want to point at some sins and say, well, that's so bad. Glad I don't do that. Paul flips it on its head and says, no, there's things that are worse, but you're probably doing them. He goes from what some would call the worst sins to the things that we're all guilty of practicing. Remember, he started out, we were ungrateful. Sometimes we're not real grateful to God for what he does. And then he goes into meddling with the sins that we practice and says, because we don't think about God, we don't like to retain God in our knowledge, we don't want to acknowledge his existence there in verse 28. He gave them over again. He allows them to do these things. There's been a lot of God allowing them to follow. He sets up curbs, but if they keep going the wrong way, he allows them to go the wrong way. And this is what happens. Filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness. What? Even covetousness? Yeah, being greedy. He just stuck it right there, didn't he? Maliciousness, being full of envy. We're sometimes full of envy, aren't we? We envy others. Why do they got it so good? I was talking with someone just today that filled with envy. I don't like the things that are going on in my life. I want to be like everyone else. Everyone else has problems too. And we'd probably complain about those things too. They are not only full of envy, there's murder. Well, we think that one's a bad one, right? Strife, causing problems among the groups of people, causing problems within the church. Deceit, being sneaky, being a liar. Evil-mindedness, they are whisperers, they're gossips. I always thought it was funny. The same people that are gossiping about those people doing those things, they're actually doing these equally bad things. Remember, it's not Paul you can blame for this one. It's God. God's giving us the bad news. And I can keep going here. They're whisperers, they're backbiters. You just snap at people. That's mean. Haters of God. A lot could be said on that one. They're violent. They're proud. Oh, no. Yeah, he even goes into those who boast. Yeah. Kind of think too much of ourselves sometimes, don't we? Inventors of evil things. Disobedient to parents. Did you go through your terrible twos? Were you a rebellious teen? Chances are we've all sinned in these ways. You may pat yourself on the back and said, well, I didn't get caught, though. That's didn't what he said. He said it was those who, maybe you were sneaky, maybe you were defiant, or maybe you were just subtle in your rebellion. But we've all been disobedient, undiscerning. We just refused to see the obvious and did what we wanted to do anyways. And we see here untrustworthy, broke our promises, unloving. We weren't kind. We didn't do for others as we would do for ourselves. Unforgiving. Yeah, he just added that to the list too. That person that you don't want to forgive, well, that's worse than some of the other sins we've already talked about. Unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, we practice such things. So I kind of belabored the list of sins here because I really want us to get the grip of what Paul is doing here. He started it there at the wrath of God in verse 18, and he won't finish until he gets to Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Because Paul wants us to realize the bad news. We are sinners. We need a Savior. We all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We've all gone our own way. We have each done our own way of rejecting God, of not giving him what he deserves. And so the bad news is, without Christ, we're sinners and we deserve eternal punishment. If we haven't asked for forgiveness and a new heart from Christ, that's what we're getting. But God is a really good parent. We may have each gone our own way. We've all gone away from God. God, like a perfect parent, doesn't want his creation to perish. He gave his only begotten Son to rescue us from us, to rescue each of us from our own sin and its penalty and its power. He gave us his Holy Spirit to regenerate us, to sanctify us. Two fancy terms. That means to give us a new heart, a new way of thinking, so that we no longer have to follow the corrupted thinking, desires, and feelings. Instead, we can have God work within us to want to do according to his good pleasure. So the question is, will you let him do that work in you? That's what's hanging in the balance here. It's some bad news. I couldn't avoid it. If we're going through the letter, we had to go through the bad news. But I want you to know, he's setting us up for the good news. There's a gospel message. God can declare people like this, like you and me, to be right in his sight, if we'll only trust Jesus to do it. I pray that you've done that. I pray that you join me again. We'll continue on our journey through Romans. God bless, God keep you.